I am ex-Detective Inspector Walter Henry Thompson and was Winston Churchill's bodyguard for a period of nearly 18 years.
In almost any piece of film you'll see of Britain's great wartime leader, this is the man in the background, anonymous and secret. Until now, his critical role in saving the life of Churchill from a series of attacks has been hidden from the wider public.
He himself intended that he would never be taken alive, and he issued direct instructions to me. I was to have his 4.5 Colt fully loaded. He intended to use every bullet but one on the enemy. The last one he saved for himself.
After the war, Walter Thompson's censored book told just part of the story. His full memoirs were suppressed even by Churchill himself. Only now can we recount the number of assassination attempts on Churchill's life, many foiled by Walter. This series, with unique access to these incredible memoirs, reveals for the first time the story of Walter's life with Winston. Together they traveled thousands of miles on precarious journeys to meet Stalin and Roosevelt and other world leaders. Together they rode with Lawrence of Arabia, dodged German assassins, were nearly shot down by enemy aircraft, lone gunmen, U-boats, and IRA hitmen. This is a story of the political upheavals of the 20th century. Churchill's constant brushes with death and the role played by an ex-post office messenger in preventing an early end to his life.
And with this weapon, he was a dead shot. Anyone that came within range of this weapon would never survive.
Walter and Winston flew back to Cairo from Tehran on the 22nd of December 1943, having safely evaded the German attempt to assassinate the Big Three. For Walter, this must have been an enormous relief, as evidence emerged from British counterintelligence of how serious this threat had been. It may have been a successful conclusion to one of the most nerve-wracking episodes of Walter's career. But within a few days came one of those moments when all Walter's devotion and skill probably kept Winston alive. For he insisted that he stay with Winston on the very night that his doctor expected him to die. For Winston, the Tehran conference had been a depressing occasion. Not only was he still ill from his cold, but he was concerned by the way President Roosevelt had constantly sided with Stalin and seemed to be naively unaware of the sort of man he was dealing with. President Roosevelt also came back to Cairo, and the two men took the opportunity to settle one piece of vital business.
A short conference in Cairo between Winston and the president ended with a visit to the pyramids, where an Arab guide acted for them, giving much information to the president. He in turn offered money to the guide, who refused it, saying he was honored to act as a guide for them. The pyramids were where part of the history of the Second World War was decided. A decision had been awaited from the two principals as to who would be in charge of Overlord. Of all places for such a momentous decision to be made, the pyramids would appear to have been the last. Here, the president proposed General Dwight Eisenhower. This was a surprise to Winston, but he had the warmest regard for the general and agreed on the president's choice.
Walter was once again edgy and keen to get Winston back on British soil. His memories of Egypt in 1921 gave him grave cause for concern. He felt out of his depth in this strange culture he did not understand. And Winston wasn't making Walter's task any easier. It was probably on this occasion that Winston was due to pay a courtesy call on the Egyptian king Farouk at the Abdin Palace in Cairo. And there was something which he deliberately wasn't telling Walter.
On this occasion, I only accompanied Winston. On our arrival at the entrance to the palace itself, Winston instructed the driver of our car to wait on the other side of the courtyard. He then turned to me. "Thompson, have you got a white handkerchief and my Colt revolver?" "Yes, sir, I have both." I thought, why the revolver? Then, "What is the time by your watch?" We compared watches, but I was very disturbed. He had never before asked for his revolver. I always carried it for him. "There is something wrong. You must have some definite reason for taking your revolver into the palace. Let me come in with you." "Thompson, I know exactly what I'm doing. And if I'm not out in, I think it was about 15 minutes, wave your handkerchief above your head." I then spoke very definitely to him and told him that I was determined to enter the palace with him. "Do as I say, Thompson." And with that he turned and entered the door, having first put into his trousers pocket the Colt. After he had entered, I walked up to the doorway and remained there, where I could see inside. Shortly after, Winston appeared with a broad smile on his face. "They wouldn't dare. They wouldn't dare," he said. "Dare what?" I asked. "There was a rumour that I might be assassinated in there." "Why the handkerchief?" I asked. "If you had had cause to wave the handkerchief, it would have been seen, and within minutes tanks would have rolled into the courtyard. We are surrounded by them. I think that those inside the palace were also aware of the presence of the tanks, and I had banked on such a thing happening. At least I should have accounted for several of them with my revolver." I was not appeased, however. Very foolish to go in there without me. He made no further mention of the affair, but as we left the palace courtyard, I was able to see a number of armoured vehicles which were on our route back to the hotel.
Why had Winston not told Walter about the threat? There is no doubt that he was ill, and this may have affected the clarity of his thinking. Also, the prospect of danger always made him excited, and this may also have caused him to leave Walter completely in the dark. Although still far from well, Winston would not let up. He now set off on an 8.5-hour flight to Tunis for an overnight stay with General Eisenhower. He then intended to visit the troops in Italy.
After the excitement of these meetings dealing with matters of the highest policy, reaction seemed to set in. In the plane, he appeared tired and listless. Long before we reached our destination, he was impatient to be there. There was an irritating delay when we were diverted from Tunis airport. We had to land on a small airfield some miles away.
Things went from bad to worse, as Commander Charles Thompson, Winston's naval aide and not a relative of Walter, described in his own diary. The PM, who looked ghastly, insisted on getting out of the York, and for the best part of half an hour he sat chilled to the bone on one of the packing cases which littered the field. Walter, too, had noticed.
The old man looked exhausted and drawn. I told Lord Moran, his physician and friend, that I thought he was ill. "I think he's only tired," he answered, "but I will watch him." "Well, sir, I've been with him for many years, and I believe he is ill."
Eventually they made contact with Tunis and were told that it had all been a muddle. The airport there had only been closed so that they could land without interference, and they should never have been diverted. They took off again.
As soon as we arrived at the White House in Tunis, Mr. Churchill went straight to bed. He slept for some hours. Then it was discovered that he had a temperature. He was developing pneumonia.
This is Walter's account of what happened. His family feel that it was as much as he dared to put in writing, and there is more that happened here than he could ever reveal.
I was asked to take a turn in the night watching over him. I suggested that I should stay up for the whole night, as I was used to doing so in my job, and Mr. Churchill would not be disturbed at seeing me around. Before I went on duty at 11 p.m, Lord Moran told me to listen to the tempo of the Prime Minister's breathing, and if there was any sudden alteration, I was to call him immediately. There were double doors at the entrance to Winston's bedroom, and as I sat outside, I could hear distinctly Mr. Churchill's fast, stentorious breathing. About 2 o'clock in the morning, the sound ceased. I opened the door and crept into the bedroom. All was silent. I reached the bedside. Still silence. I was sick in my stomach. I don't remember in the whole of my life such a feeling of shock and fear. I leant over the bed and brought my head down almost to Winston's pillow. He was breathing quietly and steadily. With a feeling of terrific relief, though it was some hours before I recovered from the first shock, I went to report to Lord Moran. He came to the bedside, listened and said, "He's breathing better now. You were quite right to call me." I resumed my vigil outside the door. A little while later, I heard Mr. Churchill moving in the bedroom. I went in to see that he was comfortable. He lay back on the pillow and said drearily, "Thompson, I am tired out in body, soul and spirit." "No, not in spirit, sir," I answered. "You are just very tired after a strenuous time. Now that the conferences are ended, I hope that you will be able to get a little rest." He lay back for a few minutes with his eyes closed. Then he looked at me and repeated, "Yes, I'm worn out. But, with returning animation, all is planned and ready." Suddenly he sat straight up in bed and flung out his arms, crying, "In what better place could I die than here, in the ruins of Carthage?" "Don't say that, sir," I pleaded, as he sank back into the pillows. "The world needs you." He sighed and dropped off to sleep as suddenly and peacefully as a child. It was certainly one of the most extraordinary nights in my experience. I was glad that I was allowed to watch him alone in this hour of crisis.
Nowhere in the books and articles he published after the war did Walter give such a clear and extensive account of that traumatic night. He was obviously so shaken that there has been speculation that the moment when he said that Churchill's breathing ceased was a great deal more serious than he subsequently let on. It is quite possible that Churchill really had stopped breathing completely, or even that his heart had stopped, and that Walter had had to take much more drastic action than he was prepared to admit. He had learned first aid as a young man and probably kept up his skills in the police service. He would have been quite capable of giving some sort of emergency resuscitation.
My father was quite capable of resuscitating anybody who'd stopped breathing. He had quite a good knowledge of first aid, for a start. It was something he was always very, very keen on, something that he used to teach to us, Boys Brigade, as far back as that. He used to take classes in general first aid and resuscitation.
Whatever happened in those few moments, there is no doubt that this was the nearest to death that Winston had ever been since Walter became his bodyguard. But the crisis was not over yet. The morning after Walter had heard Winston's breathing die away so dramatically, Lord Moran began calling in the top heart and chest specialists available in the Mediterranean theatre. It was as well he did, for Winston remained seriously ill for several more days. Moran later admitted that at one point he expected Winston to die, and that was even before the Prime Minister had suffered another, mercifully slight, heart attack.
Gloom settled on the villa as Mr. Churchill's staff eagerly awaited day by day for the doctor's bulletins. Then, as he turned the corner, the heaviness lifted. Mrs. Churchill's arrival at the bedside gave him considerable comfort, and as he began to regain his strength, he also demanded to be allowed to get back to work. It was a tonic to us all to see Winston about again. Everyone in the party appeared bright and cheerful. On Christmas Day, he attended a large dinner party at the White House and enjoyed it thoroughly, but was tired before it ended.
In his journal, Walter allowed himself to be far more critical of Lord Moran than he ever was in print. He always had a low opinion of his skill as a doctor.
What puzzled me is that Lord Moran, knowing that we should be absent from England for some weeks at the conferences, had apparently not made any provision for the treatment of chest troubles to which he knew Winston to be prone. At Carthage, where we were in rather an isolated spot, he complains that there was no chemist. No doubt a number of drugs, including antibiotics, were necessary, but I should have thought he would have carried some with him. I've wondered what Winston would have said to me at Carthage, or in any other place, if someone had pointed a gun at him and I had said, "Sorry, sir, I cannot do anything. I have left my gun in London. Perhaps I'd better send for the military to come and guard you in the meantime."
Walter very definitely agreed with Sir Jock Colville, Winston's private secretary, who was once asked by a junior colleague what he should do if the Prime Minister became ill. He replied, "You telephone Lord Moran and he will send for a real doctor."
The time came when the Prime Minister was sufficiently recovered to be moved to a warmer spot for convalescence. We left Tunis Airdrome for Marrakesh. Elaborate plans had been made for the flight. Strict limits had been laid on altitude, and an RAF doctor flew with us with oxygen apparatus. We flew at about 7,000 feet and were making a detour to avoid the Atlas Mountains. Mr. Churchill, who was cheerful and feeling fairly well, suggested the direct route, which meant climbing higher. Those in attendance on him were against the idea, but the Prime Minister had his own way, so we climbed carefully to over 10,000 feet. At each stage, Mr. Churchill asked the doctors to check his pulse, and when each check was satisfactory, he cried with gusto, "There, I told you I should be all right."
After 2 weeks of convalescence, Walter and Winston flew
and on his first entry to the House of Commons after his illness were heartwarming. But they could not drown for me the silence of that dark night in Tunis.
This is probably Walter's tacit admission that Churchill had in fact clinically died. For Winston and Walter, a critical moment was now approaching: the invasion of Nazi Europe. The build-up of US troops and weaponry had now been going ahead for 9 months, ever since the U-boat menace had effectively been ended in the spring of 1943. More than 1 million US troops were now training in the country. Winston had fought hard to ensure that an invasion would not be launched prematurely. Now he accepted the inevitable, that the planned landings in northern France must go ahead in summer 1944. And, Winston being Winston, having done so, he threw himself wholeheartedly into the preparations. The D-Day landings would be perilously dangerous and pose new challenges for both men. To keep abreast of the D-Day preparations, Winston now set up a regular weekly meeting with the Chiefs of Staff, which was attended by General Eisenhower or his deputy, Walter Bedell Smith. Given his bitter experience of amphibious landings at Gallipoli and more recently at Dieppe, Winston was particularly concerned about two areas. How were the Allies going to be able to break through the formidable fortifications of Hitler's Atlantic Wall? And how would they be able to supply themselves once ashore? To solve the former, Churchill insisted that the highly imaginative pioneer of tank warfare, General Percy Hobart, be brought out of retirement to command a unit which would develop a range of specialist armored vehicles. Among them, swimming tanks. Vehicles designed to tackle soft sand and shingle, and to get over sea walls, and across deep ditches. Hobart's funnies, as they became known, played a major part in helping the British and Canadian troops establish their beachhead on D-Day, and owed much to Winston's enthusiastic support. Aware that the Dieppe disaster of 1942 had shown that the Allies could not hope to capture a fully operational port during their first assault, Winston could also claim personal credit for the idea of the Mulberry Harbours, the prefabricated concrete structures which were towed across the channel to form two enormous artificial harbours. It is said that he played with the first models in his bath and gave the idea all his support. Winston also held a regular lunch every week with Eisenhower and Bedell Smith, and was constantly in and out of the Supreme Commander's headquarters.
These were on the outskirts of London, but the whole world was their province. There were secret telephones linking directly with Washington and Moscow. Secret radio wavelets enabled the planners to contact military chiefs in various parts of Europe and bombers in flight.
Using his special train, Winston inevitably tried to get as close as possible to the real action.
The Prime Minister was here, there and everywhere, watching preparations for the invasion. He visited docks, aerodromes, training grounds and stores. Everywhere he took every opportunity of talking to those who were to participate in the great adventure. On one inspection of American troops, he was shown the bazooka and the US carbine. He took on Generals Eisenhower and Bradley at target shooting with the carbine and showed up well against them. Then he fired the bazooka several times and said he was very pleased with it.
It was not just the assault forces in the south of England that he visited, for the scale of the invasion was such that reserves were being billeted and trained all over the country.
An extensive tour of Yorkshire, visiting British units, followed. The Prime Minister was deeply impressed by the speed and agility of which the huge men of the Guards Armoured Brigade jumped in and out of their tanks.
But Winston was never happier than when visiting the areas nearest to the enemy coast.
At Hastings, the party was taken to some high cliffs. Here they were shown the technique of carrying casualties up and down the most sheer face of the cliff on stretchers, to which the cases were strapped. We were also shown the terrible devastation that can be caused by flamethrowers. Standing on the cliffs and gazing across the channel, Mr. Churchill said to the mayor, "How far is it from here to the French coast?" "About 60 miles, replied the mayor. Mr. Churchill was silent for a minute, and then with a grin said, "What are we waiting for? Let's get started and get at 'em."
With his terrible memories of both Gallipoli and Dieppe, Winston was on edge as the final days passed before the great invasion.
He was keyed up for the invasion. On May the 30th, we left London by special train. Infinite trouble was taken over the safeguarding of certain maps that went with us. They were placed in a secure location nearby, while the train remained in a siding. The day was fine, and Winston was able to spend the whole time travelling round by car inspecting the loading of the landing craft. The years of careful and brilliant organisation told. Everything seemed to go like clockwork. The troops were in high spirits, and many had decorated their vehicles with all kinds of slogans, such as "Hitler, here we come," and "Berlin, first stop." The next day he stood watching troops embarking at Southampton. Many of them touched his coat as they passed and called for a speech. He did not want to speak. He was too full of emotion, so he called out, "Good luck, boys." A soldier called out, "Have you got your ticket, sir?" "What ticket?" asked Mr. Churchill. "One like this, sir," said the soldier, holding up a piece of paper. "It entitles me to a free trip to France." I wish I had. If only I were a few years younger, nothing would have kept me away. Mr. Churchill was disappointed that he had not seen as many troops as he had planned to do. He decided to go by boat down Southampton Water to view the invasion armada as it passed. As he walked down the gangway, the troops called for a speech. Mr. Churchill climbed onto a paddle wheel and with deep emotion said, "The time has come for you to liberate Europe. Good luck and Godspeed to you." It is impossible to describe adequately the voyage down Southampton Water. The panorama of ships of all types needed to be seen to be believed. The streams seemed endless. They surrounded us. The lines continued as far as the eye could see, and we were told that there were many more to come. At Portsmouth, the Premier visited a cipher ship, which was to be the key point for controls of the various invasion plans. Everything was ready, but the atmosphere was one of worry and anxiety. I was told that the weather reports were unfavourable, and that there was a possibility that the start of the invasion would have to be postponed.
The beginning of June 1944 saw massive storms driving into the English Channel from the west, and the decision of whether the landing could be risked was becoming a critical one for the Supreme Commander. But by Walter's reckoning, he would now have to face an even greater problem.
We went into General Eisenhower's headquarters, and discussions continued there late into the night. General Eisenhower, however, now had a much more difficult decision to make. Winston wanted to go over with the troops, and his request placed the Commander-in-Chief in a most difficult dilemma. However, he realized that the possibility of Mr. Churchill becoming a casualty was too important from the standpoint of the whole war effort, and he refused Winston's request. Mr. Churchill argued at length and brought in to aid his request the fact that, although the general was in sole command of the operation, it did not include control over the British organisation of the exact composition of any ship's company in His Majesty's fleet. Slyly, Mr. Churchill continued, "By shipping myself as a bona fide member of the ship's complement, it would be beyond your authority to prevent my going." The general then pointed out quite forcibly that if Mr. Churchill went over, it would add to his personal burden, but he realised that he could not stop him from going. However, aid came from an unexpected source, for the King, having heard of Winston's intentions, sent word that if Mr. Churchill felt it his duty to go on the expedition, he, the King, felt it to be equally his duty to be present and to participate at the head of his troops. This altered the position entirely, for the Prime Minister could not agree to His Majesty going, therefore, in effect, the King stopped Winston. General Eisenhower's sympathies, however, were with Mr. Churchill, but I would very much like to know who told His Majesty that Winston wished to go. I am sure, however, that although Mr. Churchill pressed the point to the general, that the affection which existed between the two would have prevented any break between them by Winston ignoring the general's wish.
On the afternoon of the 4th of June, the weather reports for the next day were so bad that Eisenhower decided that the invasion must be postponed. But the meteorologists were confident that a break in the storms was coming, so Eisenhower made the critical decision to delay the landings only by 24 hours, until the 6th. Many of the troops were already at sea and had to endure an appalling wait.
In London, the Prime Minister could not settle to anything. Throughout Monday, he was on edge and only relaxed when late that night the dramatic message came through. The invasion is on. He then snatched a few hours' sleep before going to Buckingham Palace to lunch with the King. Afterwards, they together visited SHAEF headquarters, where they studied the latest reports from the battlefield with General Eisenhower.
By the time Winston met King George VI, he knew that the first Allied troops were ashore successfully and were pushing forward. On the 2 British beaches, Gold and Sword, and the Canadian Juno, the funnies proved their worth as troops got over the critical seashore quickly and began fighting their way inland. On one of the US beaches, Utah, the troops also got ashore in good order. But on Omaha, where the cliffs proved more formidable than anticipated, they were pinned down on the beach, taking heavy casualties until late afternoon. By the time of Winston's evening meeting with General Eisenhower, the Allied forces had established a secure beachhead. And British troops on the left flank had fought off the first coordinated counterattack by the German 21st Panzer Division. For the next few days, the Allied forces continued to push forward against stubborn German resistance. Their control of the air was so total that German counterattacks and reinforcements to the battle area were being severely disrupted. Inevitably, Winston was desperate to get into the great drama in person. Walter knew that he couldn't be held back forever, and this new threat gave him more than a headache. How can you protect someone who insists on getting in amongst the fighting?
On June the 12th, the Prime Minister decided it was time for him to cross to Normandy and see how matters were for himself. Accompanied by General Smuts and General Sir Alan Brooke, we sailed in the destroyer Kelvin. I landed with the Prime Minister, but owing to lack of transport, was left on the beaches. It was a strange feeling to be the solitary civilian among so many troops. Some press correspondents came to my rescue. They told me where I could contact the Prime Minister on his return, and also supplied me with some food. While we were eating some sandwiches, I noticed I was sitting near a small rack containing German hand grenades. Don't touch them, or anything else you see. Most of them are booby traps. I was also told to keep to the trodden part of the sand, or the road, between the lines of tapes, pointing out at the same time that we were sitting on part of the minefield which had not been cleared.
Walter was not the only one at risk that day, for he was missing one of the most extraordinarily lucky escapes which Winston was to have during the entire war. The Prime Minister and his party were driven in brilliant sunshine to a chateau about 5 miles inland from the beaches, where General Montgomery had established his tactical headquarters. The front was only 3 miles away. Monty had briefed them in his mobile map room, one of a group of caravans hidden amongst trees in the garden. As they left to go to lunch, a strange incident occurred, which was later reported by Major Noel Chavas, Montgomery's aide-de-camp. General Smuts stopped, sniffed the air, and then said, "There are some Germans still here, quite close to us." He was assured that there couldn't be, that the whole area had been thoroughly searched. "I can't help that," retorted Smuts. "There are Germans near us now, I can always tell." He looked around suspiciously, peering into the dense clumps of rhododendrons and laurels which surrounded the caravans. Eventually, he followed the rest of the party into the mess tent, and the incident was forgotten. But 2 days later, 2 young German paratroops emerged from a huge rhododendron bush only a few yards from where Smuts had stopped. They had been cut off from their unit and gone to ground, scraping a hole among the roots of the bush. Still fully armed, they could have caused mayhem amongst the Allied High Command had they decided to become heroes. Instead, they lay there terrified until hunger and exhaustion made them give up. It was an extraordinary incident, but one which was not revealed to either Winston or Walter until very much later. Totally oblivious of the close shave the Prime Minister had just been through, Winston and Walter met up again after 7 hours and went back to the destroyer. Once aboard, Winston made one more attempt to get into the action by insisting that they sailed along the coast until they were off a German artillery battery.
An order rang out, and we fired several salvos into the German position. No reply came, and at last we turned for Portsmouth. As we were walking from the ship to the train, General Smuts said to the Prime Minister, "I think the captain of the ship was rather cross with you for ordering him to fire on the German batteries." "Why?" asked Winston. "Because the destroyer was well within the range of the German guns and they might have fired at us." "That's what I did it for. I wanted them to fire."
Yet again, Winston had failed to achieve his dream of coming under fire, and Walter could breathe again. But only for a matter of hours, for even as they were on the train back to London, Hitler had unleashed the first of his revenge weapons, the V1 flying bomb. And Walter was back to where he'd been 4 years earlier, trying to stop Winston putting himself at risk by insisting on watching this second blitz. 27 V1s were launched that night. 4 reached London, and 2 civilians were killed. Over the next 3 weeks, 2,754 dropped on the capital, and 2,752 died. This level of casualties was far below those of the original Blitz of autumn and winter 1940-41. But the fact that the doodlebugs could appear at any time of the day or night with little warning frayed the nerves of a people who had endured almost 5 years of war. Fortunately, the V1s were a relatively primitive weapon. They had no guidance system other than a timer, which cut the engine once roughly the right number of miles had been traveled. They had a range of barely 200 miles, and their pulse jet motor could only propel them at 400 miles an hour. The V1s were very vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, and a belt of guns was established on the south coast. It was also possible for some of the RAF's most high-speed fighters, including the revolutionary new Meteor jet, to intercept them. So within a few weeks, the number of doodlebugs getting through began to dwindle, but not quickly enough for Walter.
This form of attack brought with it, for me, a great deal of worry. For Winston called me into his room and said, "I want you to obtain the keys of the lift and arrange about the password, as I intend to go on the roof and see one of the flying bombs. I shall be notified when one is coming in our direction." I replied, "I wish you would not go up there, sir. If one exploded near you, it would kill you." "I said I want to go up," he insisted. "Make the necessary arrangements." I always knew when I had to accept what he said, but at the same time I decided to do my best to prevent his being on the roof in time to see one. 3 times I took him up in the lift and through all the locked secret rooms and out onto the roof. But each time, all he saw was the flying bomb after it had flown over. On the 3rd occasion, he turned and looked straight into my face and said, "This is very peculiar, Thompson. On all previous occasions when you have brought me up here, I have passed through onto the roof without any difficulty. But on these occasions, I have noticed that the lift has gone up too high, then too low. Eventually, it has been level with the floor so that I can get out. In the past, you have always known the various keys to open the doors of the rooms we pass through. On these 3 occasions, you have fumbled with them, and eventually, but too late, we have emerged onto the roof. I don't believe you want me to see them." "No, sir," I replied. "I know that if one exploded near you, it would kill you. I must try to prevent that." He smiled. "All right. We will not come up again." He kept his promise.
The V1 threat was finally brought to an end at the beginning of September, when Allied troops overran the fixed sites in northern France from which they had to be launched. But while this second blitz was in full swing, Winston's determination to expose himself to fresh dangers in the front line had continued.
At the end of July, the Prime Minister again visited Field Marshal Montgomery and spent 3 days with him in Normandy. General Sir Hastings Ismay accompanied him, and several conferences were held near Caen, which was later visited by Mr. Churchill. He also visited sectors of the US Army front and toured several RAF airfields. On this occasion, he paid special attention to the fine work done by the RAF and gave a short address. He reminded the men of 1940, when we were alone, with only perhaps 100 field guns and 20 tanks, and contrasted our position then with what was happening at the time he spoke.
Winston would have been aware that this visit came at a crucial time for the Allied campaign in Normandy. Montgomery's master plan was for the British and Canadians on his left flank to keep pressing towards the city of Caen. This would draw in the German panzer reinforcements as they managed to fight their way through Allied air attacks to the Normandy battlefield. Meanwhile, US troops, facing less determined resistance, were able to push west and prepare for a vast right hook which would lead to a breakout. Montgomery had launched Operation Goodwood to capture Caen and hold the bulk of German armor to the east, 3 days before Winston landed. And by his arrival on the 22nd of July, Caen had been taken by the Canadians, and the British were locked in combat with the German 5th Panzer Army. By the time Winston decided on another trip 2 weeks later, the situation had changed dramatically. On the 24th of June, the US First Army began to create a massive hole on the German left flank. A week later, a new US Army, the Third, under America's most flamboyant general, George S. Patton, blitzkrieged through this, cutting deep behind the German forces defending Normandy. No wonder that by early August, when Patton had already thrust forward almost 100 miles towards Paris, Winston was desperate to get back to the action.
Weather conditions prevented our plane from landing, and we had to return to Portsmouth. Winston was furious. He jumped out of the plane and turned to one of his staff. "My blood's up," he said. "I will fly tonight. Get onto the Air Ministry and find out the weather forecast. I mean to go."
It was only when he was told that not only was the weather forecast still bad, but the Dakota flying into the airstrip ahead of his had crashed in the murk, killing everyone on board, that he finally agreed to stay the night. When Winston reached Monty's headquarters the next day, the Western Allies were on the brink of a military triumph. Patton's US Third Army was swinging round south of the embattled German Army Group B, while the remaining Allied forces in the Normandy bridgehead pressed in from the north and west. The stage was being set for a massive encirclement. Over the next 2 weeks, the Allies would achieve their hard-fought breakout. The liberation of continental Europe from Nazi rule would become inevitable. But there would be much hard fighting to come, and many opportunities for Winston to put himself at risk, both from enemy action in the field and the assassin's bullet. Walter could not relax his guard. Even as he got the Prime Minister home from his second visit to the Normandy battlefront, a new and unstoppable danger was threatening London.